Pineapple Media Podcast Network presents This is Protecting America. Now, here's Emmy-winning journalist Rita Cosby.
And welcome to another edition of Protecting America. I'm Rita Cosby. So how extensive was the weaponization of the legal system against President Trump? And could it happen again? Our guest is the author of a very powerful new book. It is called Lawless Lawfare, Tipping the Scales of Justice to Get Trump and Destroy MAGA. Boy, oh boy, it's a blockbuster. And Washington Times legal affairs reporter Alex Swoyer did a great investigation with access to the court proceedings, the attorneys, and much more. Alex, it's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I felt like I could have kept writing. It was just like the lawfare and all the weaponization of the courts. It just hasn't stopped, it seems, since, prior to the 2024 election.
So how deep is the corruption in our judicial system?
Well, my background is as a reporter and also a lawyer. And so when I was covering the 2024 election, I was just very troubled by constantly seeing all these, lawsuits that were coming up against President Trump, the former president at the time, and his inner circle, some of his supporters. So I thought it really needed to be highlighted, but it kind of went even deeper for me because I have covered the courts and the Supreme Court basically since 2017. I've been in D.C. since 2013 reporting from the Hill. And one of the things that just bothered me immensely was that I could look at the judge assigned to a case and see which president appointed that judge, and then have an idea of basically before any hearings happen how the judge is going to rule. And I just felt like it's so disheartening. That's not how our legal system is supposed to be. Justice is supposed to be blind. So I felt like that is something that needed to be highlighted. And that's really what I did with Lawless Lawfare is it kind of was through the eyes of what's happened with President Trump and the legal battles he faced and those around him. But it also goes deeper just about the distrust of our courts and how the American public view it, especially when it comes to these kind of politically charged lawsuits and, never before seen type of litigation.
When did it get so bad? And why did it turn so politicized? Because I agree with you. And as someone who's been a journalist, I've been a journalist a long time, Alex. I never used to think about, okay, well, who appointed that judge or who did that? Because I agree with you. It's supposed to be blind. When did it turn and why?
So, lawfare is not something that's necessarily new. We've seen it used against politicians in the past by political opponents. However, it just kind of I guess you could use the term blew up in the Trump era. That was a question. What you just asked me was something I asked Attorney General Ken Paxton out of Texas. He spoke to me about the book, and he was basically talking about really he saw it that Trump was effective, and that's why it just, I guess you could say, mushroomed under him in the Trump era, since basically I go back to Russiagate, the whole Russia collusion that we followed for years, which led to $40 million in special counsels being spent, taxpayer money, resulting in, no collusion was found. And then we even had the Durham probe on top of that, kind of evaluating what went wrong there. And so I kind of make the argument that that's kind of where it kind of started under the Trump era and got out of hand with the special counsels. Then we graduated to impeachment, and then from impeachments to indictments and so forth. So, yeah, I think it was really, for some reason, I don't know if you want to call it Trump derangement syndrome hit the courts, but it seems like that's what happened.
In your book, you did sort of a full research as a journalist, and I could appreciate this. I mean, you went to the courtroom, you got the oral arguments, you talked to the attorneys, you went to the court filings. Talk about how you really took it on as sort of a journalist, an investigative journalist.
Yeah, I did. I covered these cases as they were happening in real time for the Washington Times, and I covered the Supreme Court. And so I was in the courtroom for those major battles, the one over the presidential immunity. Also, if you recall, there was the the one about the obstruction charge that many January 6 defendants were facing, including President Trump, that was heard. And then also, a lot of people forget this, but there was also the Colorado ballot case where we had all of the different states and activists trying to look at kicking Donald Trump off the ballot, citing the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which is, quote unquote, the insurrection clause that says if you've participated in a rebellion, then you can't run for office or you cannot serve. So, I was in the courtroom for all of that. And I just remember thinking about how the justices handled questions, how they treated lawyers, and when they would issue an opinion. The Colorado opinion, swiping down these activists that were looking to kick Trump off the ballot was unanimous. And I just remember thinking that was looking at polling. And prior to, it was like the public actually supported not having him on the ballot because once they read the clause, they were like, oh, okay, maybe, I guess, that seemed, I thought was a little surprising. But then after the court ruled unanimously, it was like all of a sudden the public opinion shifted. It was like, no, the majority was like, no, he should be on the ballot. And I thought, wow, like when the justices speak in one voice, it really does sway public opinion. And I think it gives, bolsters trust in the judiciary. That was something I took a look at to see, how it was when we looked at other kind of rulings that were more political, you could say, or people deemed them more political based on the division of the justices, like, for example, presidential immunity. So that was one of the aspects I looked at. And also, you'll appreciate this as a reporter, but the coverage of these cases was, to me, troubling. I looked at I have a chapter on the Georgia case that the president was facing and still is facing. It's just kind of in limbo right now, which related to Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis bringing this kind of, RICO charge against President Trump and 18 other co-defendants, and all related to the 2020 election. And I remember looking at a Media Research Center study, and it was from April of 2024, and it looked at CBS and ABC, and they covered about 99 stories related to this case at the time. And none of them mentioned that Fani Willis was a Democrat. And here's the thing, she was running for re-election at the time. So, you would think that a detailed reporter would note that the district attorney running for re-election at the time as a Democrat is prosecuting the leading Republican presidential candidate. But that was just missing from some of the legacy media coverage, which I found totally disheartening. And that seemed to be something that ran through a lot of that mainstream reporting, like we saw it with Letitia James out of New York and her civil fraud case against Trump. We saw it with Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in Manhattan, in that hush money trial where President Trump was convicted. It just seems like that the media was just one-sided, and I kind of wondered, do they not understand some of the reporting or some of the legal aspects from the courtroom, or is this intentional? I even kind of go back to being in Judge Chutkan's courtroom during the election dispute with Special Counsel Jack Smith against President Trump, and kind of turning to, it was an NBC reporter, and kind of going back and forth with that reporter, and just kind of not understanding where the reporter was coming from. There was a comment about how one of the cases at the Supreme Court where they struck down the obstruction charge that January 6 defendants were facing was narrow. And I was like, that was not a narrow ruling by any means, right? This is the Supreme Court basically telling the government that if they're going to bring this charge against the January 6th defendant, including President Trump, they have to have pretty significant evidence. So anyways, it just became one of those things where I was like, this is really interesting to see how the media framed this, what we saw, which was really an unprecedented legal attack during a presidential campaign against the frontrunner. And I found that also troubling. So, not only was I troubled by what I was seeing with the courts and looking at the judge and being able to kind of guess based on who appointed the judge how court cases would turn out, but also the media's handling and coverage of all that was just something I found alarming, including, I'll note, I have a chapter about the gag orders I really highlight throughout the book that President Trump faced. And I looked back, and after facing that, I think it was 4 criminal indictments in the span of 4 months. Those criminal cases all had him under a gag order, and he did about 90 campaign rallies while under these gag orders from criminal courts. And if anyone in America should be able to speak freely, it should really be a criminal defendant looking at, potentially going behind bars. If anyone should be able to speak and defend oneself fully, it should be a criminal defendant in our justice system. And that was not afforded to the president. And so if you care about the First Amendment, if you care about political speech in our country, that should be extremely, alarming that that precedent was able to be set.
You're listening to Leaf Filter Radio, and the guru of gutter protection himself, Chris Coonahan, is here to take your most pressing leaf-related questions.
Hey, everybody, Chris here. I understand we have Ron on the line. Ron, where are you calling from?
Uh-oh. Ron, are you calling from a ladder?
Well, I was. I wanted to ask Chris what I need to do to get my gutters ready to have leaf filter installed.
Oh, Ron, you don't have to do anything. A Leaf Filter Trusted Pro will come out and clean out your gutters, realign and seal your gutters, and install Leaf Filter, America's #1 gutter protection system.
So I didn't need to get on this ladder?
Ron, Leaf Filter Trusted Pros are in your neighborhood and ready to help. Just visit leaffilter.com/day to schedule your free gutter inspection and get up to 30% off.
Thank goodness. What was that site?
That's leaffilter.com/day for your free gutter inspection today. See representative for warranty details. Promotion is 20% off plus a 10% senior or military discount. One discount per household.
It's so much there. And you're right. And also here he is, a presidential candidate, like you said at the time, too. I mean, on top of being a criminal defendant. But they were trying to do anything they could, like you said, to muzzle him. Have you ever seen anything like that? Just in your research in modern times, I can't remember seeing anything like this.
You're right. So I looked back, and really one of the things I found surprising, I guess, as I am digging through this, was that precedent from the Supreme Court related to gag orders really showed a lot of times it was the media fighting for access, wanting to lift gag orders or have, access to the courtroom or access to someone to speak. But that was really missing here with President Trump. And you would think that the media would be active, thinking, oh, this is the leading presidential candidate, the leading Republican presidential candidate. We should be able to speak to him. He should be able to speak more freely. But no mainstream media outlet filed to contest any of these gag orders or have increased access to President Trump. There was one New York podcaster who tried to lift the gag order in New York in the hush money trial, but that was shut down. So it was that was another aspect that I was like, this is the media is supposed to be a watchdog, and that was totally, they were asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, boy, were they ever. Now, do you believe they were asleep, or were they intentionally just closing their eyes and their ears?
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in the book is how these reporters, I just think, thrive on leaks, and leaks come from those in power. And so when reporters cozy up to the DC establishment, or, I guess I think back to when I was covering the whole Russia collusion stuff, when cozy up to people like Adam Schiff, who's running a lot of that, they end up, I guess, just kind of being talking heads for that, the deep state, if you will. And so, of course, it comes out anti-Trump. I don't know, I can't say everyone's motive is political, but it's what all the data I found in this book, it makes you wonder, there's obvious bias, which, I think people have come to realize. And that's why you're seeing a lot of people go elsewhere to get news, right, to podcasts instead of the main outlets that they used to visit or the main broadcast stations. So it was one of those projects that I felt like could really, where was it going to end? Because once I did file my manuscript, then Trump, basically, it was right after he took office. And the lawfare, if you will, has somewhat changed. This administration has faced a number, I think my coworker has more than 500 lawsuits that this administration has faced in the first 6 months.
Wow.
Which is just unprecedented compared to prior administrations. So, I have to note for you and your listeners that I don't know. I think this is something we're just going to see. This is a new normal, unfortunately, using the courts for political gain, whether it's during a campaign season or, potentially to shut down what the administration is doing.
So how deep is Trump derangement syndrome? And also, how coordinated was the lawless lawfare against President Trump?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I talked to House Judiciary Committee Jim Jordan. He is obviously probing some of this, some of the potential coordination between the Biden White House counsel's office and, states that were prosecuting Trump, like Georgia, for example, Fulton County, which I mentioned, also the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, Alvin Bragg, one of the attorneys that really was prosecuting President Trump during that hush money trial was the number two at the Biden DOJ that had left that post to go prosecute this case. So, there was some overlap between, why was Fani Willis's special counsel Nathan Wade meeting with Biden's White House counsel in D.C. That just, he billed for those hours on his case that he's supposedly working against President Trump in Georgia. There is overlap, and I do think people want answers. So my hope is that the House Judiciary Committee is able to get to the bottom of that. One of the things you mentioned earlier was this idea of like the censorship that happened around all the lawfare. I talked to just a number of people, Laura Trump, Don Jr., General Michael Flynn, Steve Bannon, a lot of the people who are just caught up in the lawfare itself and how it affected them, not only like the cost of it, but like, financially, but also emotionally, like what it wore them down. Laura Trump told me that it was hard for the family to get a mortgage. Don Jr. told me about like how they were debanked like their insurance were issues. There's issues there. And you think of the Trump family, like the Trump last name, how would they have financial issues, right? But that was something that they kept coming to, like General Michael Flynn said, the attempt is to not only like silence you, but to bankrupt you.
Isn't that stunning that is happening in modern times to somebody who's running and their family, like you talk about?
Right. And, I think that that's one of the things people are, I guess you could say, painting President Trump now as kind of going back and like, I guess, a revenge, going after certain actors that have gone after him. But, I'm not sure if that's a fair analysis. What we just talked about, like, being debanked or having your insurance drop you, looking at some of the people that were prosecuting him, what they were doing themselves. I think we have multiple people, Adam Schiff, Letitia James, all under investigation by the Trump Justice Department. So, that's one aspect that I think is even another way to go down in terms of the media coverage and actually like the quote unquote lawfare itself. I think that, by some people will say, oh, this is just, spiteful revenge. But in terms, it's really trying in many ways to right a wrong and get to the bottom of what was happening over the past few years.
Yeah, and make sure that it doesn't happen again, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And, is that through indictments from this Trump DOJ? Possibly. I know a lot of people I talk to want to see answers, want to see indictments. Steve Bannon told me he thought maybe the answer was to do public hearings, getting all this out in the open so the American people can see what was actually happening. If there was this coordinated effort, for example, like what you mentioned, was the Biden White House, Biden Trump Justice Department involved in some of these state prosecutions? People want answers. And I think that I talked to a pollster who tracked some of these lawsuits and how they kind of play on the campaign trail. And he said that it just, obviously it backfired, look at the results, but that the people were just lost. And this idea, it was just one of the thoughts that came to mind talking to him, too, was do I title the book Lawless Lawfare, which I did, or Overkill? Because it was just so much overkill. Like he said, people were like, what's wrong with hush money? Like, don't celebrities pay that all the time? They just really didn't understand what the Democrats were doing with that case out of Manhattan. And then he said, the Georgia case, people are throwing words out like racketeering, and like nobody's really following what's going on there. And that the stuff with the classified documents down at Mar-a-Lago just seemed over the top because, the American public see that Joe Biden had classified documents and Hillary Clinton and others. And yet
got a pass.
Exactly. So it just kind of reeked of, of course, in D.C. there's only double standards, right? And the American people, I think, really saw that. And I think it may have motivated more and more to turn out for him. The lawfare might have actually helped him get that popular vote.
Why do you think, your book is called Lawless Lawfare, but the subtitle's Tipping the Scales of Justice to Get Trump and Destroy MAGA. So the plan, you believe also, was clearly not to just destroy Trump, but sort of destroy his movement because why there was such a bond. I'm curious on that.
Yeah, I want to give you a good personal example. So I actually know a First Amendment attorney I'm friends with who spoke to me for the book, and his client spoke to me too. So it was a couple out of Texas who counter-protested the Biden campaign bus. And, they ended up having Democrats and Big Law come after them and prosecute them, or I guess in a civil way, under the Ku Klux Klan Act, okay? So they basically were allegedly violating the right to vote by counter-protesting the Biden bus. And here they are, like, in their, Trump train vehicle, just kind of counter-protesting. They ended up winning, and the First Amendment, of course, was their defense. But that was after hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees that this couple had, little Texas couple had to pay out to, defend their right to protest. And that's just, one example of, targeting the MAGA movement and those that, trying to silence. Another one was I had an interesting January 6th defendant I talked to, Brandon Straka. He founded the Walkaway movement, which he has a huge following on social media and whatnot. And so he was at the January 6th rally and then the riot at the Capitol. And he didn't go inside the Capitol. He took a video outside and he posted it online. And for that, I think he was looking at 4 counts, 30 years. So he ended up doing a plea deal. But he told me, he had to pay for legal fees, not just for his criminal case to get that figured out, but also he was civilly sued by some of the Capitol Police. I think it was brown and black officers that alleged that he violated the Ku Klux Klan Act, a few of the January 6th defendants. And he said, it took so much money, but through discovery, they realized that some of the officers suing weren't even where they were in Maryland at the time. It was one guy wasn't even there. He said that some of them were on a different end of the Capitol that he was.
Wow.
So it was the case ended up going away, but after he spent $300,000, and then not to mention he also had to go before the January 6th committee and have counsel there. So it's just, even supporters who were just financially drained.
It's incredible what people who have been affiliated with Trump have gone through. I guess my final question is there going to be a Lawless Lawfare Part 2? And what do you think is ahead? And also sort of a double-fold question, Alex. If the Democrats were to take the House in 2026, is there any doubt in your mind that they'd try for impeachment? Al Green, I think, will try for impeachment before he walks back to his office.
Yeah, I think he's probably already trying to figure out how to, what he could do already with impeachment. I know there was a little bit of excitement back with the Iran strikes, I believe. There was impeachment talk, and that kind of was silenced pretty quickly. I think Democrats, one, knew that since they didn't have the House, it wasn't going anywhere. But two, are they smart enough to realize how much this lawfare backfired on them? In 2024, have they learned their lesson? I'm not so sure. So only time will tell to see if they're going to go down the impeachment road. They probably will have a new speaker at the time. So we'll see if, I remember covering Nancy Pelosi during the last 2 impeachments against Trump. I'm not sure, if she's going to be able to have her predecessor, do that again. We'll see. But I'll surely be there to cover it if it happens. In terms of a lawless lawfare, too, I'm thinking it was one of those topics where I could have just kept writing and writing and writing.
Right.
And like I mentioned, the administration now facing all these lawsuits, it's still a form of lawfare. It's just changed slightly. So, anything is possible for sure. I think a lot of this definitely needs highlighted. And I try to write not for lawyers, but for, everyday Americans and voters that care about this topic.
Well, I think so many people do, and I agree with you. I do think it backfired. I think it could have been called overkill, too, just as you brought up, Alex, because I think the American public saw it, and you're right. It still looks like it continues with a lot of these rogue judges and some of the crazy decisions. But boy, oh boy, our eyes have been opened to it, and your book is fantastic. I'm so glad that you covered this topic and did such a great job. Everybody,
Thank
again,
you
the
so
book,
much.
the book is called Lawless Lawfare, Tipping the Scales of Justice to Get Trump and Destroy MAGA. And everybody be sure to subscribe and share to this podcast. Alex Swoyer, thank you so much. Great job on the book and wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
And everybody, I'll be back soon with another great edition of Protecting America. And of course, you can catch me every weeknight, 10 p.m. to midnight on the legendary WABC Radio. This is Rita Cosby, and thanks for all you do to protect America.